Case Western Reserve University's Institute for the Science of Origins proudly presents the Origins Science Scholars Program. The Institute advances the scientific understanding and application of origins and evolution of human and natural systems. The Origins Science Scholars Lectures are presented with the assistance of Case Western Reserve University's Siegel Lifelong Learning Program, College of Arts and Sciences, and Media Vision. Tonight I'm very pleased to bring to you Dr. Jean Burns, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Biology at Case Western Reserve University. Jean's studies take an evolutionary perspective in answering ecological questions such as why do some species become invasive and others not? Please join me in welcoming her as she gives us her talk about From Rude to Food.
Thanks so much, Glenn, and thank you all for coming out this evening to hear about plant-soil interactions and how they influence our food supply and our native plant systems. So we'll be hearing about plant pathogen interactions. You can see on the top figure a potato plant that has been negatively affected by a pathogen, late blight, and I'll tell you a little bit about how late blight is affecting our food supply. And on the bottom you see garlic mustard, which is an invasive plant that is a very common problem around here. So many things affect and limit our food supply, and one of them is competition. If you have ever had to weed your garden, you probably have an intuitive sense that competition is very important and limits the production of food. So in this example, you see a corn crop field, and on the left, you see that it's been weeded, and on the right, you see that there is an invasive grass species. This is giant foxtail. And this grass species is very competitive. It's a very strong competitor. And both grass and the grass species and corn are in the same plant family. So you might be able to tell that they are closely related to one another by how similar they are in their shape. You can see they have similar shaped leaves. And because they're both grasses, they're both vulnerable to the same herbicides. So it's really very difficult to use herbicides to control this weedy grass in corn crops. And so you can see they had to do mechanical control. They had to go through this crop field and mechanically weed it in order to control this invasive grass. So obviously competition can limit the production of food, but so can pathogens. This is an example of a pathogen that you might have heard of. Late blight is the disease that resulted in the Irish potato famine. So this is a very devastating disease for potato crops. You can see a diseased potato on the left. It's been very heavily damaged by this pathogen. It's a pathogen that occurs in the soil, and it can kind of stay dormant in any sort of potatoes, seed potatoes that are left behind in the soil. So if there's any potato material left behind, the next year you can get that pathogen cropping up again. So my parents grow potatoes in their backyard, and every year they have to rotate where they put those potatoes from one year to the next. They have to move them around, because if they put potatoes in the same field year after year, that pathogen would become a major problem and would damage the plant. So this is the kind of thing I mean by plant-soil interactions. You probably already have this sense that there are pathogens in the soil. They negatively affect plant performance, and they can occur year after year. They can lay dormant in the soil, and they can pop back up and cause a lot of damage. For example, in Europe, the potato crops there are about a €6 billion a year business. And about €1 billion a year in damage is caused by late blight alone. So this one disease is just terribly damaging to potato crops. And that same disease is also terribly damaging to a close relative of potatoes, the tomato. So some of you were telling me that you grow potatoes in your yards. It's a very common thing to grow in our yards. We love fresh, homegrown tomatoes. And tomatoes are also subject to late blight, this terrible pathogen. For example, in 2009, there was a big outbreak of late blight, and it was caused by the spread from a single nursery into a lot of kind of commercial nurseries. So a single nursery had this infected tomato plants, and they were selling them in your local nursery. People would go there, they would buy them to plant in their yard, and they would accidentally pick up plants that were infected with late blight, and they would spread them around. So there was a terrible epidemic in 2009 that spread really rapidly across the northeastern United States, and many home growers and growers who rely on tomatoes for farmers markets were devastated by the effects of late blight. So it's a very devastating disease, and it affects multiple plants in this particular plant family. Now, in addition to all these negative effects, like the negative effects of pathogens, there are also organisms in the soil that are beneficial for plants. So a wonderful example of this are the mutualists that live in the soil and that fix nitrogen that benefits many of our legume species, like soybean. So this is a picture of a soybean plant, and you see the plant on the right has these rhizobial mutualists, and the one on the left doesn't have those mutualists. Those mutualists are a bacterium, and they live in close association with the plant's roots, and they fix nitrogen from a form that plants can't utilize into a form that the plants can then utilize. So in return, the plant gives them a nice place to live with a low oxygen environment that they like, and also some nutrients. So the plants are giving nutrients to the bacteria, and the bacteria in turn is making nutrients available to the plant. So that's what makes this a mutualism, a mutually beneficial interaction, is that the plants and the rhizobium are both benefiting one another. There are lots of other examples of mutualisms. Another wonderful example of a mutualism is mycorrhizae, which are many different species of fungi form these relationships. They occur in the soil again, and they associate with plants' roots. So this is an example of a tomato plant on the right. It has those mycorrhizal associates, so all those white threads that are coming out from the roots, those are actually not roots. Those are fungi. Those are fungal threads that are coming out from the roots, and those fungi help the plant take up nutrients, for example, phosphorus. They're really good at phosphorus uptake. And the plant in turn shuttles sugars that it has made to those fungi. So this is, again, a mutualistic relationship. It strongly benefits the plant. The plant makes more and bigger fruit, so this enhances food productivity in your garden. If you were to grow plants, they might benefit. For example, if you were to add mycorrhizae to the soil, they might grow better and produce more food. So this is all wonderful. We now know some things about pathogens and about mutualists in the soil and how they influence food production. But even more interesting than that is that the evolutionary history among plants also influences how these pathogens and mutualists might interact. So this is an example of a phylogeny among some plant species, and a phylogeny describes the evolutionary relationships among species. So species that are very close together, that is, they're connected by these bars, those species are closely related to each other. And you can see, for example, that there's a family of strawberries on the top here. So you saw those in our snacks earlier today. There's a family of strawberries that's very common for food production. There's a family of peas you see at the top. And I'm just going to zoom in on the bottom part of this graph and point out that there's a family of plants called the Solanaceae, which has both tomatoes and potatoes in it. So you noticed earlier that that pathogen, late blight, is influencing both potatoes and tomatoes. It doesn't influence every plant. It doesn't negatively affect every plant out there. It mostly hits species in this one plant family. So the evolutionary history among plants is really strongly influencing their vulnerability to pathogens, and they might help us predict what species are vulnerable to particular pathogens. And then on the bottom here, you see the Poaceae, the grass family. And many of our common crops are grasses. So corn, for example, is a grass. So is wheat. So is barley. So many of our very common and very important crop species are grasses. And many of these relationships among the grasses might help us to predict, for example, what weeds are going to be problematic. So when you saw the giant reed influencing the corn crop, that is really strongly influenced by the evolutionary history among these plants. So considering this evolutionary history is going to help us to better understand how things like competition And pathogens and mutualists might structure relationships among plants and how plants perform in the world, including how food production is affected by these factors. Okay, so I think we have a couple of minutes for questions, if anyone has questions.
So late blight affected so badly the potato crop in Ireland when everyone had to, they were dying or they were emigrating. Has nothing been discovered that will prevent it or at least ameliorate it?
So can we control late blight? Late blight, one of the problems with late blight is that it has both an asexual and a sexual part of its life cycle. So many of the asexual parts of its life cycle are the things that caused the Irish potato famine. So there was a single kind of genotype of late blight that was introduced in Ireland, and that is what spread and was so damaging. And there are chemical controls, there are fungicides, which can help control late blight. So there absolutely are some chemical controls that can help us control it. But because of this mix of asexual and sexual reproduction, sometimes there can be a bout of sexual reproduction that can result in recombination, and then a new strain of late blight can emerge, which is problematic and hard to control. And so this is kind of it's like a runaway train where we're like Alice in the Looking Glass, right? We're always chasing this evolving pathogen, this evolving problem. So absolutely, people are doing lots of wonderful research on late blight, and they're working to better understand how, for example, genetic recombination might be influencing its pathogen effects, and working on better control methods. And we're definitely making progress in that area, but it's still a very difficult problem.
Can I go to my local garden store and get some mycorrhizae, whatever, to put in the soil around my tomatoes?
Could you go to your local garden store and pick up some mycorrhizae? If it's a very specialized garden store, you probably could. There are commercial products out there, and I'm going to show you an example of a commercial product that we've used in one of our local habitat restoration experiments. So there are commercial products that you can buy. You may not be able to find them locally. We had to order it online, but you may be able to find a commercial product that does contain mycorrhizae and that will help your tomatoes grow better.
You say there are pathogens. What are the pathogens? Are they fungi, bacteria, viruses, or all of the above?
That's a wonderful question. What are these pathogens? There are, of course, many of those things, pretty much everything that you mentioned. There are fungi that are pathogens, there are bacteria that are pathogens, there are viruses that are plant pathogens, and all of those classes of organisms do negatively affect plants and crop production. One interesting example is late blight. We used to think it was a fungus, and it can be controlled often by fungicides, but it's technically not a fungus. So there's been some new work that has demonstrated that it's actually fairly distantly related to the fungi, and it has some sort of differences in how its cell walls are structured, for example. And new molecular work has demonstrated that it's a distant relative of the fungi.
So I saw 3 kinds of millet listed in that previous slide, and I'm wondering, do we eat all of them, or what are they all used for? I mean, I know we use millet a lot for birdseed, but can also be eaten. So why the 3 types?
I don't know why there are 3 types of millet. Presumably people have found them useful for different types of products, different types of, for example, there might be a birdseed variety versus a variety that humans eat. There are lots of groups of organisms or lots of species where we have all of this incredible diversity within a species that's been generated by artificial breeding that humans have done. For example, broccoli and cauliflower come from the same plant species, and they're just so incredibly different from one another because of the artificial breeding that we've done. So presumably people have done that kind of artificial breeding with millet, but I don't know a lot of details about that. That's a good question.
Rather than taking the trouble to pose this as a question, I just want to make a comment. Now, I like your use of mutualism as opposed to synergy or synergism, and I think because your mutualism is more self-explanatory and intuitive. So thank you for that.
I like that word as well. It's a word I teach my ecology students every year.
Thank you for joining us. You've been watching Dr. Jean Burns telling us about the factors that limit agricultural production. For more information on the Origins Science Scholars Program, please visit the Institute's website at origins.case.edu. In the next part of the talk, Dr. Burns will tell us about invasive plant and animal species and the harm they do. Now, back to the talk.
Interactions can basically be either positive in the sense that both parties are benefiting, and then we would call it a mutualism, or an interaction could be sort of positive-negative. One party is benefiting and the other party is experiencing a negative effect, and that might be through competition or through a predator-prey interaction. Both of those interactions would be kind of a positive-negative interaction, or an interaction could even be neutral. So ecologists kind of break interactions down as to who benefits and if there's any cost.
Do you take mutualism to what they do with synergy, where the whole is more than the sum of the parts, and two are mutually benefiting, therefore doing more together than they could separately? That's part of your...
Okay, so the question was about synergy and whether you could think about things kind of having a synergistic interaction. And yeah, absolutely. In the case of a mutualism, each party is kind of giving the other something. And so you could think of that definitely as a synergy. And sometimes you might hear the word symbiosis, which means living together. And often things that have a mutualistic interaction are symbiotic in the sense that they're living together, just like those rhizobia bacteria are living together with the plant that is their host. So we've talked a little bit about food productivity, and we've talked about how competition, interactions with pathogens, and interactions with mutualists all can affect productivity in our crop systems. But is the same thing true in native plant systems? So for our native plant communities, are they limited by interactions like competition, pathogens, and mutualists? And of course, since I'm asking the question, you can guess that the answer is probably yes. These things do affect our native plant systems. And I'm going to tell you first a little story about invasive plants. And I'm going to call them wicked competitors because they are wicked good at competition with our native species. When I say an invasive species, I mean a species that has been introduced from somewhere else. So in the example of garlic mustard, it's native to Europe. And it's been introduced to the United States. So this is garlic mustard, is the bright green that's carpeting the forest floor in this picture. It has little white flowers. It's in the mustard family, so garlic mustard, you can tell from its name. And it produces chemicals which are very toxic to our native plants, and especially to those mycorrhizal mutualists that our native plants rely on. So the leaves produce a toxin that, when it's leached into the soil, kills those mycorrhizal mutualists of our native plants. So it's a very strong competitor, in part because it produces poisons. Very kind of direct in its competitive ability. So this is a species, when I say invasions, I mean it's a species that's been introduced and it's spread rapidly. So that's what ecologists mean when we say invasion. We're talking about rapid spread in the landscape. So you can see the native range highlighted in left of garlic mustard, and then you can see some of the locations where it's spread in North America. It's been spreading really rapidly upon introduction. And we thought, well, it's a poisonous plant. It's very damaging upon introduction. What are some of the negative effects that it might have on our native plant species? And we're particularly interested in whether it might interact with other invaders. So we know that it has a negative effect directly, but there could be some interesting interactions with other species in the system. For example, invasive earthworms. And this is work that's being done by a graduate student in my lab, Colin Cope. Colin comes to us from Pennsylvania. And he noticed that there's a lot of information in the literature about garlic mustard, how poisonous it is, but there's no information really about whether it might interact with invasive earthworms. Have any of you heard that we actually have no native earthworms in northeastern Ohio? A few of you have, yeah, but many people might be surprised to learn that we actually don't have any native earthworms in our region. And why might this be, you might ask? That's kind of surprising. So it turns out that the last glaciation was covering this region in northern Ohio. So that the glaciation was covering our region and killed out all of the native populations of earthworms. Now earthworms, they're very wiggly, they move around a lot when you pick them up, but they happen to be really slow migrators. So in spite of the fact that they move around a lot, they don't move across the landscape very fast. So our native ones just haven't caught up with the last glaciation. The earthworms that we do have, they're mostly from Europe and from Asia. So we have introduced earthworms, the nightcrawler earthworms that have been introduced for fishing. So if you've been fishing with earthworms, you've probably seen those nightcrawler earthworms. If you have your bait of earthworms kind of left over when you're done fishing, we recommend not dumping them into the water because they can actually survive that. They can survive being dunked into the water, and they are mostly introduced species that are very damaging to our native species. So we recommend not introducing these nightcrawler earthworms when you go fishing. Take them back home and throw them in the trash. So nightcrawlers are from Europe, and then we also have some Asian species which are commonly used in compost. So they're great for the gardener. If you're a gardener, you might intuitively think worms are wonderful, and they are wonderful for your garden, but they are not wonderful for our native plant systems. And I'm going to show you some evidence that that's true. So this is a nightcrawler. You're probably familiar with it. You may have seen some of them coming up after a rain, covering our sidewalks. They're a European species, and they feed in this particular way. So when they feed, they take leaf litter from the top of the soil, and they rapidly pull it down into the soil. Where they feed on it, they break it up. And from a gardening perspective, that's fantastic, right? Because it's breaking down the nutrients in the soil, and it's making them more available to plants. But my undergrad in my lab, Kat Grigsby, has this wonderful story where she was working on native violets. And she was planting these native violets for her experiment. She was planting her native violets for this experiment, and she planted a violet seedling. And as she was planting it, the nightcrawler came up, snatched that violet seedling right out of her tweezers, and pulled it down into the soil. So they might not seem like a very aggressive species to us, but to a tiny little seedling, they are very aggressive. So they are very damaging to our native plants. Okay, so they feed in this particular way. They pull leaf litter down into the soil. And so because of that, we thought, well, maybe they're pulling garlic mustard leaf litter down into the soil. And we know that garlic mustard has pathogens in it. It has toxins in it, and how might that affect our native plants? So might this feeding mode of the earthworms be negatively influencing the effects of garlic mustard on native plants? So we thought about that, and we tried to figure out an experimental way to get at that question. So we thought that a nice plant to look at for our study system here would be Mayapple. If you've gone for a hike in the woods around here, you've probably seen Mayapple. It looks like a little umbrella on a stalk. It's a very common species, and it's a long-lived perennial, like many of our native species in this area. So it's a kind of similar life history to other life histories we have around here. It also has relationships with those mycorrhizal mutualists in the soil, so it does rely on those mutualists. And from that, you might think, well, if it relies on the mutualists, it's common around here, so it might encounter garlic mustard. You might think that it would experience negative effects of garlic mustard, which could poison its mutualists. So to answer that question, we set up an experiment where we manipulated garlic mustard and earthworms. Very simple experimental design. And we grew Mayapple plants in pots with and without garlic mustard and with and without these invasive earthworms. So you can see on the top an experimental pot with earthworms and one on the bottom without the earthworms. And we put garlic mustard leaves on top of both of those pots. So you can see what's happening on the top pot. With earthworms, the earthworms are taking that leaf litter and they're pulling it down into the soil. So they're reducing the amount of it that you see on the surface of the soil. So the earthworms are feeding just the way we expected they would. They're definitely moving the garlic mustard around. But then how does that affect the native plant? Is it negatively affected by garlic mustard? And it turns out that it is. So what you see here is a pot without garlic mustard on the left and a pot with garlic mustard on the right. And you can see the Mayapple plant on the left is about twice as big as the plant on the right. Can you see that the one on the right is smaller? I know there's not a lot of contrast there because the garlic mustard leaves on the ground are also quite bright green, but basically the plants with garlic mustard are about half the size as the plants without garlic mustard, but only when you include invasive earthworms in the experiment. So the earthworms are very dramatically affecting how negative the effect of garlic mustard is on this plant. That suggests that there's this interaction, right? It's not just about garlic mustard, it's not just about earthworms. To understand the effects of these invasive species, we really need to understand the interactions between them. So that's the kind of take home from Colin Cope's experiment. Now, in addition to understanding the negative effects of invasive species on our native populations, we might also want to be able to predict who's going to become invasive. It would be really wonderful if we could prevent the introduction of potentially invasive species by understanding the traits of invasive species. So what are the traits that are associated with invasiveness? This might help us answer some really core questions about invasive species. And to start addressing that question, PhD student Jennifer Murphy has been working on this. Jennifer comes to us from Cleveland Metro Parks, so she used to work from Cleveland Metro Parks, and she also got her master's degree at John Carroll. So she's a local, and when she was walking around through the forests, she noticed that we have a lot of invasive rose around here. How many of you have seen invasive roses or knew that roses could be invasive? A few people did, yeah. So basically, there is a very common rose around here, the multiflora rose or Rosa multiflora. It has these white flowers. It's a very common species. So if you've seen a white flowered rose in our forests, you've probably seen multiflora rose. If you've walked through the forest and got your jeans snagged on a thorn, you've probably seen multiflora rose or encountered it. So it's introduced from Asia. It's a native of Asia, and it's highly invasive. It was actually introduced intentionally by the USDA. They introduced it thinking, oh, this will make a wonderful hedgerow species. It'll be great food for birds because it produces these wonderful red hips that birds like to eat. And all of that is true. It does make a great hedge and it does feed birds, but it also spreads really rapidly. Because it provides this food for birds, birds like to eat those hips and they like to move all around. And so they move those rose seeds into our native forests where the plants then establish, and they are a very strong competitor. So often where you see a big thicket of multiflora rose, you might not see any native roses or any other native species at all. It's a very strong competitor. So the roses make a great study system for Jen's question because there's many species in this rose group. Obviously, you know there are many roses, and some of them are very invasive, like Rosa multiflora is, but some of them are not invasive at all, or very kind of low in their invasiveness. So if you grow roses in your yard, you probably think of them as kind of delicate, right? They need to be babied. They need to be sprayed with fungicide. You've got to do all sorts of things to get your roses to survive and to do well in your garden. So it's very puzzling that a few of them are invasive. And it suggests that these invasive species might have traits that could make them better at invading. So what Jen thought is, well, one of the things that makes a species invasive is making lots of offspring, right? Just lots and lots of, in the example of plants, seeds. So if you make lots of seeds, you might be a really good invader. That makes a lot of sense, right? Pretty simple idea. And if making lots of seeds means that it costs you a lot of energy per seed, you might, as a plant, want to make a small seed. So plants that make smaller seeds tend to make more of them, and so seed size might be a nice, quick metric that we could measure very, very easily that would tell us something about invasiveness. So that was Jen's idea. Her idea was that the more invasive roses would have smaller seeds than the less invasive ones. And so to test that idea, she measured seed size across a broad variety of different rose species, and she considered the evolutionary relationships among roses. So this is an example of the rose phylogeny on the right. And she did this because she thought seed size would be similar between closely related species. So if evolution has structured seed size, then you would expect that closely related species would have similar seed size. So you would expect that thinking about the phylogeny would help us understand seed size. So you can see in her pictures of rose seeds that Rosa multiflora makes a pretty small hip, a rose hip, and it makes lots of them, just lots and lots of rose hips. And each of its individual seeds are pretty small. You can see it next to the penny there. It's making a pretty small seed. Another rose species that's much less invasive is Rosa carolina, the Carolina rose, and they make a bigger hip, much bigger hip, and bigger seeds. It's a little bit hard to see that difference in seed size there, but they do make somewhat bigger seeds. So really, to think about this question of how does seed size correlate with invasiveness, we needed to think about these evolutionary relationships. And I want to just point out that we have a couple of comparison groups here. For example, we have Rosa carolina and Rosa virginiana. They're really closely related to each other, and they vary in their invasiveness. And this is going to help us answer that question. I'll show you how in a second. And then we have two other groups. We have the multiflora rose and its close relative, and we have two other roses here, one of which is very invasive and the other is much less invasive. So I'm going to point out these groups to you on the next graph where we see the results of her study. So to think about whether invasiveness might be correlated with seed size, what Jen did is put them all on one graph. So she put the species means on this one graph. And what you see is increasing invasiveness on the x-axis. So species toward the right are more invasive, like Rosa multiflora is. And species toward the left are less invasive, like many of our wonderful native roses, or like the roses that you grow in your garden. And then you see seed mass on the response axis. And we predicted, you remember, that there might be a relationship between these, and that the more invasive species would have smaller seeds. So we predicted a negative relationship between these two traits. Do you see it? The negative trend? Is it weak? It doesn't look very convincing at all, does it? I think it looks really weak. I think this looks like no relationship at all, pretty much, between these two traits, until we start thinking about relatedness. So when we start thinking about phylogeny, this is what we see. So let's compare one of those clades, if you will, one of those groups of close relatives. So when we compare a closely related invasive and less invasive species, you see that the species that is more invasive, the one toward the right, has smaller seeds than its close relative, right? And then let's look at another group, another clade, if you will, of close relatives. And again, within that clade of close relatives, the more invasive species has smaller seeds, like we predicted. And then again, if we highlighted that third group, you see that the more invasive species, in this case Rosa multiflora, the one we have around here, again, it has smaller seeds than its close relative. So if we hadn't thought about relatedness at all, if we hadn't thought about phylogeny, we might not have understood that there was a relationship between seed size and invasiveness. And this could be really useful because it could help us predict who's going to become invasive in the roses. So if we understand both relatedness and seed size, we can make a better prediction, and we can stop introducing species or try to prevent the introduction of species that might become very problematic. So this could be very helpful to us from a prevention perspective. Obviously, understanding the negative effects of invaders is a great first step, but it would be even better if we could prevent the introduction of very problematic species. Okay, I think I have time for a couple questions.
Is it true that invasive species like garlic mustard are equally toxic in their native environment as in their non-native environment?
So are invasive species similarly toxic in their native environment? In general, the answer is probably no. So in Europe, where garlic mustard is native, it has a very minimal poisonous effect on native plants, presumably because they've evolved in that same arms race with garlic mustard over a really long period of time. And so they've had the chance, presumably, to evolve resistance to that toxin. So that's a great question. That comparison hasn't been done very often for these toxic chemicals, but where it has been done, we see really different effects in the native versus the introduced range, which might help us explain why some species are so invasive, because when they get introduced, they leave behind the species that were strong competitors against them.
When smallpox came over from Europe, the natives here had no resistance to it whatsoever, whereas the Europeans did.
Diseases can be much more problematic or much worse, more virulent, when they're introduced to a novel population that has never experienced them before. And we think that's why late blight was such a problem for potatoes. So potatoes are native to the Andes Mountains in South America. And late blight is native to central Mexico. So they're not really native to the same place. They both encountered one another in Europe and in North America, where basically the potatoes hadn't evolved resistance against late blight. And we think that's why it's such a problem. So basically late blight is another invader.
How does one know which worms were native in this environment, since the last glacial age was quite a while ago?
One thing that we could do is try to look at the fossil record and look if we could see examples of earthworms from a long time ago. If we can, maybe that would tell us something about who was native a long time ago. Or we could look back historically to historical records of what people have described when they first arrived to northeastern Ohio. So did they describe earthworms when they first got here? And when they didn't, it was because there weren't any here. So historical records, basically, is the short answer.
Blame the Rosa multiflora introduction on the USDA. My dad was a beekeeper, and he was attracted to Rosa multiflora because of the pollen involved. And he, we have 100-acre woods in Chardon, and it is full of Rosa multiflora now. And apparently it is spread along with grapevines also by bird distribution. Anyway, I'm glad to hear my dad wasn't the sinner that we always thought he was.
We often call species invasive, and we use this really negative language, but they do have positive effects as well, like the forage for birds that they provide or the forage for pollinators that they provide. So it's really not a black and white issue of invasive species are always terrible, right? Sometimes they have positive effects. And there was a very interesting back and forth in science a couple of years ago that was very controversial about whether invasive species should always be considered bad, should they always be removed, or maybe we should sometimes consider keeping them around if they have beneficial effects as pollinator forage or as bird forage, or these kinds of positive effects that they might have. And deer eat them? Yeah, deer eat them and love them. So that's also a good point.
I'm interested in this point here. There was a book, I can't remember the guy's last name, but it was called Bringing Nature Home. And it was by a ecologist from University of Maryland. And one of the things that he discovered was why are invasive species bad? And he was dealing mainly with trees, which are introduced by landscapers. And he found that they basically cannot support the native insects which feed on them. And so this affects the bird populations and can have lots of system-wide effects depending on who eats whom. But I wonder if this is also true for non-woody plants as well that perhaps don't depend, for example, on insects so much, or that insects don't depend on for food so much. But I mean, you hear often this blame game played with invasive species. They say, well, you have to have weakness in the environment. You have to have diminished biodiversity or something that makes the native species more susceptible to losing competition with invasive plants. And it sounds like what you're saying is that's not necessarily true.
I agree with the second part, that it's not necessarily true that the environment is degraded and that's what causes invasions. It's definitely true that if the environment is disturbed or if there's lower biodiversity, it might be more vulnerable to invasions. But even in the absence of that kind of disturbance, we can see invasions, in part because of exactly what you're describing. Ecologists call that enemy escape, where a plant upon introduction might escape from herbivores. So for example, when you see this picture of garlic mustard, you might notice that nothing has really eaten it, right? This is a big, beautiful resource that's out there in the forest. There's loads of it. You'd think somebody would be taking advantage of that resource and eating it, but nobody is, right? There are no insects chomping on this plant. The deer really aren't eating it very much. And so you can clearly see that it's escaping from for example, insect predators. So I think you're right that we're probably seeing some enemy escape in many of these invasive species, and that alone could explain why they're such a problem, even in the absence of environmental degradation or low biodiversity.
We hope you've been enjoying the Origin Science Scholars Program with Dr. Jean Burns. Dr. Burns conducts much of her research at Case Western Reserve University's Squire Valley View Farm. In the second part of our talk, we learned about the effects of invasive species on their environments. In our final segment, Dr. Burns will discuss how scientists approach projects to restore the natural environment. Now, back to our talk.
One of the things we might really love to do as ecologists is we'd love to maintain biodiversity or even restore biodiversity when it's degraded. And so one of our just general goals, if you're thinking about conservation biology, would be maintaining diversity in natural systems. This is an example of a really highly diverse plant system in California. This is Table Mountain, and it has lots of beautiful wildflowers. Every year people flock to Table Mountain as a destination. It's like a tourist destination for people just to view the wildflowers. They're incredibly diverse. There are just fields of them. People, when they first colonized California, they talked about gold fields. So if you've read some of those historic accounts, you might have heard of the golden fields in California that were just covered in wildflowers. And so this kind of biodiversity is something that we would really love to be able to protect and to maintain. So how can some of these interactions between plants and soil organisms and competitors help us to do that? That's one of the questions we'd like to ask. And one of the things that we find is that the relatedness among plant species helps us understand interactions with those microbes and how we can best restore native plant systems. So, for example, we did a comparison in the California flora between species of rumex. So the rumex are a genus of plants. These are low-growing, weedy kinds of plants, and you see them in the small inset pictures. And these are just two closely related plants, and they grow in really different habitat types. So one of them grows along the edges of a wet marsh, and one of them grows in a seasonally wet dune. And yet when we sample the soils from around their roots, we find really similar fungal communities in the soil. Now you remember that those fungal communities are really important pathogens and they're really important mutualists. So the fungi might help the plants to establish and to grow. And we know this from comparative studies, for example, in prairie systems. We mentioned earlier that you can buy commercial products that contain these mycorrhizal mutualists. So you can buy them. And we know that these purchased products that contain the mutualist can be used to help restore native systems, for example, in prairies. But we don't necessarily know, can they be used to restore forest ecosystems? So the comparison really hasn't been done with these commercial products versus using like a natural collected product from the forest. Which of those is better for restoring native plant systems? So to start getting at that question, we've been asking this at Acacia Reservation. How many of you have been to Acacia Reservation? Lots and lots of people. So Acacia is this fantastic property. It was donated to Cleveland Metro Parks very recently. So it very recently became a Metro Park. And it used to be a golf course, as you can see from this photo. So you can see in the upper left-hand portion, that's Highway 271. And you see Cedar Road and Richmond Road there. And then you can see Beechwood Mall toward the top. So there's Beechwood Mall in that photo, and right next to Beechwood Mall is this new Cleveland Metro Parks. So it was a golf course for a really long time. It was a golf course for 100 years. And it's been embedded in this urban matrix, this very disturbed urban matrix. So it's a long ways from being a natural habitat. And because it was a golf course, it was very heavily managed. In fact, they even used to put mercury into the soil to control fungi, so to control fungal pathogens. So they used to do incredible things to keep this golf course looking beautiful and being a great golf course, right? So it's very, very heavily managed for a long time. So one of our questions is, how can we restore this wonderful new opportunity? Can we turn it into something that's a little bit more like our natural habitats? Can we reestablish native trees at this site? How can we reestablish them best? Might we do better if we used some commercial inoculum with mycorrhizae? If we were able to add mycorrhizal mutualists to the soil, would the plants do better? Or what if we added mutualists from our native system? What if we went out to the forest and we collected some soil, some presumably locally adapted mutualists? Could we better restore the native trees? And this project was started by Connie Hausman, and she wonderfully entitled it From Fore to Forest. So her idea is, can we take it from fore, right? So can we take it from a golf course into a forest? And how can we best do that? So that's what the experiment is designed to do. Figure out how we can best restore the forest. And it's a collaborative research project. It's a collaboration between, obviously, Cleveland Metro Parks and Holden Arboretum. David Burke at Holden Arboretum has been helping us with understanding these fungal mutualists in the soil and characterizing them, getting a better understanding of who and what they might be. And it's also a collaboration, obviously, with Case Western Reserve University. This is the site when we started to establish it. So we put it in the old driving range, because the old driving range was this long, narrow spot, and it was pretty flat. So it was a really nice place to put an experiment. So that's what the driving range looked like right after we first plowed it. So we plowed it, we dissed it, we prepared it, and then we planted 400 trees this summer. So if you ask me what I did with my summer vacation, I was getting very hot and dirty and planting many, many trees. This is a research project with Andy Lance. You can see Andy on the right here with a tulip tree. He's very passionate about trees. He used to work for Cleveland Metro Parks before he came to Case Western Reserve University, and he is passionate about tree restoration. So this project is his baby, and he spent all summer watering trees and making sure they survived our very, very hot and dry summer. And the project was also made possible by funding from the Charles L. Pack Trust and the Conservation Fund. And they helped us all this summer with our planting and our purchasing of the trees and of the mycorrhizal mutualists that we put in the soil for the experiment. And this is what an overview of it would look like if you were to fly overhead. This was our experimental setup on the left, how we were sort of arranging the experiment. And then they did a flyover very shortly after they dissed the site, and you can see how beautiful it looks. It looks exactly like we planned it to look, amazingly enough, once you put in those experimental plots. So that's what it looks like from the air. If you were to drive over to Acacia Reservation, let's say you have a little time on the weekend and you want to see this experiment, drive through the parking lot. So if you go into the entrance, there's pretty much only one entrance off of Cedar Road. Drive into either one of the Cedar Road entrances and drive down to the end of the parking lot. And then look to your left and you'll see a big deer fence. And obviously we had to put a deer fence up because our deer, bless you, they're very overpopulated, and they can really eat up our native seedlings. So if we had tried to plant this experiment without a deer fence, we would have been very sad because we would have been unable to establish any trees. So the deer fence is there to protect the trees as they establish. But if you peek inside that deer fence, you'll see our experimental trees. And then we've also planted a kind of understory of native plants, native prairie plants, to both help prevent erosion, to help those trees establish, and also their wonderful pollinator habitat. So unfortunately, we just mowed it recently, so you can't see those wonderful flowers quite as much right now. But in the peak of summer, they'll be out there and blooming, and it's great. Pollinator habitat, we saw a lot of monarchs coming through this site, and we saw a lot of bird species that are migrating birds that are starting to use the site. So it's already becoming a successful restoration in the sense that it's becoming habitat. So it's wonderful to see that establish and grow. So our first initial question, this is very early days for this experiment, so I don't have a lot of results for you, but in the early stages, we're starting to see effects of adding these mutualists on plant growth. So I just want to show you a quick comparison for two of our oak trees. This is an oak on the left with mutualists, and an oak on the right that was planted without mutualists. So hopefully you can see those bright green leaves on the oak that was planted with mutualists. On the oak that was planted without mutualists, it's a little sad. It's definitely not establishing as well or growing as quickly as the plant that did have mutualists added. So when you asked earlier, could I buy these mycorrhizal mutualists to add to my tomato plants? Well, we bought this mycorrhizal mutualist that we added to these oak trees. We purchased it, we put it in the ground, and it did an incredible job of helping these plants to establish. So it definitely worked. So that's very early days. We're still doing our comparison between the purchased inoculum, the mycorrhizae that we bought, and the one that we collected from the native forests. So I don't really have a comparison there to show you, but stay tuned. Hopefully I'll be able to update you very soon on what's happening with those experimental treatments. And hopefully we'll have a wonderful restored forest in the not too distant future.
When you add the rhizomes to the mutualist to the soil, how large an area do you need at the base to incorporate it? Is it 1 foot, 6 inches?
If you were to add these mutualists to the soil, how much would you need to add? Very, very little. So maybe about a cup worth of liquid that has these mutualist spores in it. So you can buy the spores, mix it up with a liquid, and then pour it into the soil. It doesn't take very much. It only takes a very small amount, maybe within a circle of about less than a foot in diameter.
Smallpox was essentially eliminated by introducing a enemy or a competitive species, the cowpox, and I'm wondering if a similar thing is being done with other invasive species here, where you look for the natural enemy in the natural environment for that invasive species that you want to eliminate.
The idea that you could use biology to control biology is a very old idea, and ecologists have been calling it biocontrol for a long time. We used to make terrible mistakes with biocontrol. For example, we introduced cane toads to Australia to feed on a beetle, which was a crop pest. And it turns out that cane toads don't even eat that pest. So we've made some terrible, terrible mistakes in trying to do biocontrol, but we've gotten better at it. We've gotten more scientific about it. We've started doing experiments where we actually make sure that the putative, the pathogen or the enemy actually does what we think it should do, right? And the USDA has a protocol in place where we go out there, well, the USDA does, and they do experiments where they identify potential biocontrol agents from the native range. Like, for example, if we were trying to control Rosa multiflora, we would go to Asia and we would find things that eat it. For example, there's a seed predator that feeds on the seeds of Rosa multiflora, and we might find that insect, and we might do controlled trials in a very controlled setting where we make sure that it's not going to harm our native species. So we need a species that's very, very specific, right? Like a pathogen that really only hits that one species, or an insect that really only eats that one species. So it's very hard to find things that are that species specific, but sometimes we can do it, and sometimes people have, the USDA has successfully introduced biocontrol agents, but it's pretty rare that it's been successful. Thanks very much, appreciate it.
The Origin Science Scholars Lectures are presented by Case Western Reserve University's Institute for the Science of Origins, with the assistance of the Siegel Lifelong Learning Program, the College of Arts and Sciences, and MediaVision. For more information on the Origin Science Scholars Program, including a full video archive, please visit the Institute's website at origins.case.edu.